GCSE Warfare Through Time, short revision clips, 20th century, modern warfare, recruitment and training. So Britain started the 20th century with about a quarter of a million men in the regular standing army. Of course, then you get the First World War breaking out in 1914 and a much larger army being needed. So this sees a huge recruitment drive led by Lord Kitchener, the Minister for War, the famous posters, "Your country needs you." Propaganda posters, PALS battalions, all of them exploiting a sense of patriotism and duty. And within about 8 weeks, you had 750,000 men volunteering for service in the war. However, by the middle of the war, January 1916, you get the Military Service Act, which establishes conscription because there has been a decline in volunteer recruits. And conscription means that unmarried men between the ages of 18 and 41, and indeed later that year for married men too, were conscripted into the army, and nearly 3 million men were conscripted into the British Army during the First World War. Of course, conscription ended after the war when such a huge army was no longer needed. But of course, we have the Second World War breaking out in 1939, where conscription was introduced immediately at the beginning of the war. The age range of men was increased slightly, so you're looking at the ages 18 and 51, meaning that by the end of the Second World War, you've got 3.5 million men conscripted into the army. The end of the Second World War, between 1948 and 1960, because of the developing Cold War, the development of NATO, a need to defend the British Empire, there is a limited form of conscription that remains. This is known as national service, and this is where men aged between 17 and 21 had to join the army for 18 months and would remain as reserves for 4 years afterwards. When national service ended in 1960, the army returned to being a permanent volunteer standing army. Now, another reason why recruitment has changed during the 20th century is the gradual increasing role for women in the British Army. So in the First World War, women worked as volunteer nurses behind the front lines, or were recruited into the armed forces, the auxiliary corps, the Women's Royal Naval Service, the Women's Air Force, where they would maybe fix ships and work on planes. By the time of the Second World War, unmarried women between the ages of 20 and 30 could be conscripted to work in the armed forces or in a factory or in civil defence. And during the Second World War, the Women's Voluntary Service had about 1 million civilian members. Fast forward to 1992, you get women integrated into male units in the army, so actually in combat for the first time. And women now make up about 10% of the British Army, but are not allowed to be involved in certain sections of the army. For example, the SAS, the elite troops, the Special Air Service as it's known by. Now, in terms of officers, during the First World War, about 50% of army officers were promoted from inside the ranks of soldiers, but that was partly as a result of casualty rates being high. 3 out of 4 officers nowadays have a university degree and will be involved in professional training at places like Sandhurst Military College. So today, the British Army, including the Royal Navy and the RAF, the Royal Air Force, probably totals around 150,000 men and women. It pays competitively, it operates at a very high level, there is professional training. Of course there is, because of the high-tech equipment that modern warfare demands. And alongside that, alongside the regular army units, you have part-time reserve soldiers who train alongside regular army units, and that is, of course, the TA, or the Territorial Army.